we moved to Oneida, and Granny Hogg, as everyone called her, lived in a double log house about halfway between my house and the Walker house. She wore a long black dress, black bonnet, and white wool mitten. She always had them on, hot or cold. There was an old stable on the spot where the first school building was. I mean the Marvin Hall. It's the one that he was working on. And before the old stable was torn down, there was a jack kept in it, and to me, that was a very ferocious animal. If I went over the hill to help cold irons, I would go well around so as not to get it started braying. I didn't know why they kept it, only wish they would. There was a wide porch, and the women would get off their horses or mules and hitch them to help cold irons. And there was one old lady that would always say to me, "A whistling woman and a crowing hen always comes to some bad end." I was a good whistler when I was young and had good teeth, but after dentures, no more whistling for me. But I still think men should whistle more. They would have better thoughts if they were whistling. The counters run down both sides and across the end of the store, and there were nail kegs of all sizes. And you would hear someone ask where so-and-so was, and, well, they would be nail kegging it. They were loafing. We had Arbuckle coffee, sweet tobacco, and the brown mule. We had large round crackers in barrels, and a hoop of cheese they would slice with a lever. Brown sugar in a barrel, dark brown, and sometimes light brown. Men would get a dime's worth of sugar and crackers, and it would be all they could eat. Some men would get a can of peaches and crackers. We had a white bowl for peaches, and of course a spoon, which would be wrenched out and dried for the next time. No dishwashers, of course, but no one ever got poisoned. Lots of bolts of calico and gingham, yellow sheeting by the yard, and some white sheeting by the yard. None in full widths like we have now. And after a few washings, the yellow would get white and soft. Bibbed overalls for men and boys, work socks, long black stockings for girls. They were real fuzzy, and I didn't like to wear them. Fish gigs and frog gigs, and about anything in the hardware that you wanted. Of course, one didn't want much in those days. We also had a water mill, and men would start coming early. The first bag was laid to start the stack, and each one would cross their turn on the other, and then when all of the corn had been brought in, and it got time to start grinding, they would turn the sacks over, and the first man that came would be the first to get his grain. That's how they started to call it a turn of corn. The miller had a little slick, well-used box to measure the toe. He would dip it in the sack, take the little stick and rake it level, and that would go in a box. By the time all the turns were ground and all gone, he would have a good-sized box of corn for our meal for the next week. If there was a widow woman in the neighborhood, my daddy would give her a turn of corn. The old mill house was made of log and, of course, up over the creek, and lots of fun to play in. The first day of school, the very first building was just over the hill. The field where the gym is now was where we had our picture taken. We stood far enough apart to touch fingers, and that made quite a large group all spread out like that, or to me it was. When we needed to be excused, we would lay a book on the floor by the door, open of course, only one book at a time. And sometimes they would catch the teacher busy and slip another book, and two would go out at the same time. There was one family, very large. They would bring their dinner in a long tin bucket and their milk in a flat tin bucket. They would have 10-pint cups hung all around the bucket, a cup for each one. Late in the fall, they would have mutton, and when they took the lid off their bucket, you could hardly stand the odor.
Well, this is the story of Charlie the Chigger, who lived in a berry patch. He wasn't very big, you could hardly see him, but boy, he can make you scratch. His main occupation from dawn to sunset was looking for a piece of skin. And when he found some, he'd give a whistle. Old Chucky took care of his skin. Charlie the Chigger, boy, he can make you scratch. Charlie the Chigger, stay out of his berry patch. Early Early one morning before the dew dried, old Charlie was sitting on his perch when he spotted a young fella and his sweetheart heading on the way to church. Now Charlie, he'd never been to a meeting, but he was quite willing to try, especially after he got a look at that sweet thing with all them soft places to lie. Charlie the Chigger, boy, he can make you scratch. Charlie the Chigger, stay out of this berry patch. Just as she reached over to pick a ripe berry, old Charlie gave a mighty leap, and his friends were following fast thereafter. They each had appointments to keep. I guess I'd better tell you all what happened. Them youngest never made it to church. They was found in the creek just a-washing and a-scrubbing by the sheriff on a countywide search. Charlie the Chigger, boy, he can make you scratch. Charlie the Chigger, stay out of this berry patch. Old Charlie, he swam to the shore in the meantime and crawled on a low limb to dry. The boy was a-trying to explain what happened, and the girl was beginning to cry. My advice to all you sweet young lovers, if you don't want explaining to do, stay away from the berries of my friend old Charlie when the bushes are covered with dew. Charlie the Chigger, boy, he can make you scratch. Charlie the Chigger, stay out of this berry patch.
We carried our drinking water from a house close by, and two would always go for water. One of my teachers was Willie Rice, and he was crippled and walked on crutches. He could throw his legs in any direction. The evening recess, we would choose up girls and boys, and no one ever wanted me on their side because I was always a bad runner. But I made ass, and all would run and get hot. There never was enough water. Professor Burns was working on one of the buildings and would come down and drink cold, thick buttermilk in the middle of the morning and the middle of the afternoon. Our well was in the front yard with a large roller, a long table with a bucket and a dipper and wash pans. The men would get ready for dinner. Lots of real old meal sacks for hand towels. Not too bad after they got old and soft. He was eating at our table one day when I heard him say, "There will come a time when people won't cook and eat at home." My father had a well drilled in the corner of the lot and got an old salt kettle, buried it about half in the ground. All the town came to there to butcher their hog. Most every family had their own meat in those days, and they knew how to save it. My mother kept schoolboys at $1.50 a week and bought an organ for me. After I got a little older, I took piano lessons, but didn't get very good, only could play hymns.
One cold January day, our school had been out down on Crane just after Christmas, and I had finished the 7th grade. They still had 3 months to go. I put on a big long overcoat from World War I and a warm cap and wrapped my feet up good and waded through the snow up to Oneida. I'd only been to the little town once before, but there was a big imposing school building set upon a knoll, and I headed for it. And I went inside a big hall, and I saw a door on my left, and I heard voices in there, so I knocked on the door. And a boy came to the door, and I suppose he told the teacher that there's somebody out there looking for the president. So he came back out and said, "Follow me." And he kept looking back at me and laughing. And I thought this was kind of odd. I'd never been laughed at before. This was my first taste of discrimination, that if you're slightly different, people look down their nose at you. You see, down on Crane, I wasn't different. No boy had an overcoat on Crane Creek. If you wore an overcoat at all, you wore one of your father's or some of the older members, and they usually on one heavy coat per family. But when it got over to the Anderson Hall where Mrs. Russell, the president, lived, that was an altogether different story. She didn't look at me with a funny look in her eye. She said, "Come in, young man, and warm yourself by the fire. It's a bad day out there, and tell me what I can do for you."
But a day and 12 and a half, 15, $20, 2 and a half, $30 down here, 2 and a half, 5, 35, 7 and a half, 40. Hit $40, 2 and a half, 5, 45, 7 and a half, 50. Hot $50 down here.
When I was a sophomore in high school, the teachers were better educated and they looked different and talked different, but nothing was more melodious than the bay of 7 or 8 towns echoing through the mountains in the still October evenings. James Anderson Burns had been on one of his speaking engagements up into New York. I had met a lady up there who was a member of the Metropolitan Opera, and she decided that what we mountain boys needed was some music appreciation. So every day at 11:30 in the morning, all the boys would gather up in the big auditorium, and she would sing for us from the various operas. We boys were not very attentive, but I had a friend who was one of these fox hunters, and one day she was singing away, and she got up on her toes and hit a high C and held it for what seems to me like 5 minutes. I thought surely she was going to lose her breath, and Ed Gay punched me in the ribs, and he said, "God, if she was a foxhound, wouldn't she have a mouth on her?"
Well, I gradually grew up, as you can see, and things moved a little fast. Wait a minute. We bought a farm in Mason County. We chartered a railroad car for the livestock and machinery. We finally got on the train and started. We were taking with us a man and his family and several children. We had 4 children. The oldest boy and the tenant's boy were very hard to keep up with, since I could not get around too good. Then the children wanted to eat. Mary, the other mother, had brought a lot of food for the children. When we finally got to the farm, there was a lot of excitement. The boys exploring the farm, and the tenants moved in their house not far from ours. Ours was a very nice old country home with a beautiful round stairs that went up from the living room, and then from the back porch there were stairs going up in the boys' room. Mary sent the boys to a neighbor's house. They had asked to fill a bed tick, but the old man didn't know what they wanted. Finally, some older person going and explaining what they wanted, they got the straw. We had an old slave cabin in the backyard, and after we got settled and got ready to plow, we decided to tear the cabin down. And someone found a very pretty cut glass dish.
Somewhere the sun is shining, somewhere the songbirds swell, hushed in thy sad repining, God lives and all is well. Somewhere beautiful isle of somewhere, land of the true, where we live anew. Beautiful isle of somewhere.
And I remember Oneida Institute and my high school years as 4 of the finest years of my life. So Ples and I joined the 8th grade class. When you stayed in the dormitory, every night after supper you'd have 30 minutes of free time, and then you'd have 1 1/2 hours of study hall. We just come up from study hall one night. Things had begun to settle down. All the boys had gotten in the room. Some of them were getting ready to go to bed. And at the top of the stairs on the stair post was a great big wooden ball, just almost as big as a basketball. We took that off and give her a heave, and she started rolling down, bump, 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 getting louder all the way down. And we'd sneak back by our room and grab a book and sit down. Boys began to boil out of the rooms like hornets out of a hornet's nest. Dan Hacker, the house father, came bounding up the stairs, took his fist and he knocked Willie down and said, "All right, back to study hall. 1 more hour of study hall." Down to mine and Pleasant's rooms, and he said, "Now you boys don't have to go." He said, "This is what you're supposed to do after study hall." We went to bed. Gravel road had been built into Clay County. The frontier was really going. The crash of 29 men, all of the hillbillies were heading back for the hills. Class of 19 and 30, there was no jobs. Go to college and try to become a school teacher with a provisional certificate. The local schools were controlled by 3 trustees who were elected every 3 years. And after I'd paid the $150 to get the trustee to recommend me, I had $126 left over to spend. So I taught a 6-month school, and my supplies for the year consisted of 30 foot of well rope, a water bucket, a dipper, 2 boxes of chalk, and 3 erasers. There was no maps, no charts. Everybody from the 4th grade up was a teacher. Stanley was a pale, malnourished little boy, but smart as a whip, and I had to somehow or other help him to see beyond the hills and subscribe to the Courier-Journal. We had no social studies book, so Stanley was to read the front page and read the editorials, and then I would quiz him on these when it would come time for his social studies. But his dad was down at the post office one day. All he and Stanley do is sit up there now and read the paper. Stanley and his dad and I happened to be walking down Crane Creek, stomping along through the snow, and he said, "I wish I was sitting right astraddle to the South Pole." And I said, "Al, you wouldn't want to be any colder than you are now, would you?" And Al stopped, and he took his hat off, and he threw it on the ground, and he said, "Well," he said, "I didn't know I was sending my children to school to a damn fool." He said, "Now, Joe, don't you know that the rich men and the geese go south in the wintertime, and that the warmest place in the world is at the South Pole?" Unfortunately, on December the 7th, Pearl Harbor was raided, and that changed a lot of plans.
Love is a golden ring, such a pretty thing, such an endless melody.
After several years of raising money, Dr. McConville finally built the Oneida Mountain Hospital. He ran the hospital with 1 doctor and 3 nurses for a little while. The state ran it for a few years, and then they turned it back over to the trustees, lock, stock, and barrel. And by now, most of the trustees were dead. My husband was the treasurer and secretary all this time, and it was a thank you job. The building was in bad shape, leaked all over. The electric was turned off, and we would feel our way around with the help of a flashlight. And when it would rain, we would go. We would find 4 or 5 mattresses wet, and we would find a dry bed and towel all on one, a lot of water on the floor, and it would freeze and ice, and Tom would take his corn scoop and carry it out. The telephone had been left there when the state left, and he had been paying all the bills, and one day someone suggested to him to move it to our house since we didn't have one. He wrote an awful lot of letters and contacted a good number of people trying to get some church organization to take it over. It had run in the red for the state, and everybody thought it was a bad risk. He started writing to the Seventh-day Adventists. One day a delegation of about 30 people came. We knew the day they would come, and we knew that they didn't eat meat. And since we normally build our meal around our meat, we didn't know how to start. So Elizabeth and I went to London, got the Adventist preacher's wife to make us part of the menu. And then we went home and started getting ready. We had plenty of room in Elizabeth's basement for everything and lots of good food. That day they took the hospital over. They ran it long and well. They spent an awful lot of money on it. Then it was condemned as a fire hazard. Then the time came to build a bigger and better one. It's in Manchester, and I'm a patient there now, writing from my bed. I have just been reading the Gideon Bible. The Gideons is made up of Christian professional men in more than 60 countries. Calvin Britton has been selected for Clay County, the only one in the county. To me, it's a great honor. Calvin is a real Gideon when it comes to serving the people.
Not knowing where the harbor is to keep it safe from harm. Love is all things we are. Love is all things we are. Love takes you as you are, lost amid the stars of uncertain destiny. Love gives you someone who you can give unto all that life was meant to be. And after all is said and done, and words are memories, the fullness of the living ones, the love you gave to me. Love is all things we are. Love is all things we are.
Cornerstone of Marvin Hall had a face cut out in it, and Mr. Burns put a $10 bill in the Bible and said the school would never be broke as long as that was there. When the building burned down, the book nor the money was found. Someone must have learned about it and got it out. What some people won't do for a little piece of money,